Yes, the hour is 9. Let us get started. It's 4:30. I know that there are going to be some other people coming in. At this moment, it seems like we're just preaching to the choir. And so as more people come in, I'll just let folks know that the Q&A button is available for them to put any questions and that sort of thing into there. So why don't we just go ahead and get started, and as folks come in, I'll alert people to what's going on. Shane, you want to take us away?
Absolutely. So for those who will watch this at a later date, I am Shane Tutwiler, and I'm working with Jason Chen and our colleagues also at the Ohio State University. And today we're going to talk about analytic approaches to data scarcity and complexity during COVID-19. Our hope is that this will evolve into an open conversation about the trials or the issues that various research teams on IES-funded projects had collecting and analyzing data during the acute phase of the COVID pandemic, and some of the strategies that they came up with in order to move their work forward, in part because I think we can celebrate the great work that everybody did to move the science of education forward, while secondly, learning from that and applying it to our research moving forward. The issue being that educational research is always going to be messy in the ways that were made apparent by the pandemic. And we can apply a lot of these lessons learned in all of our research contexts moving forward. So I'm going to start by framing a problem statement, the general issue that led to the this session being formed. And then we're going to work through a couple of examples, one from our Purple State 2.0 project, and then the Digital Civic Learning Project from Ohio State as another example, highlighting in each example specific issues around data generation or around data analysis in this time frame, and then have an open discussion with all participants and share our lessons learned so that we can again memorialize all of this great learning and move forward with it. So the main issue that sparked the submission of this session was that COVID-19 disrupted learning and research in numerous ways, too many to fit on this slide with this font size. But in general, we can say, for example, the move to online learning was a major disruption if our research and the learning modalities that we were looking at were place-based. Building entrance restrictions were put into place once schools opened that restricted or limited our ability to work with students and gather data. And student and teacher absences during the phase of the acute COVID pandemic also, even when schools were open, led to smaller sample sizes, truncated data collection periods, and a range of other issues. Now, this resulted in a lot of added complexity and noise to our data. So data were generally quite noisy. In other words, sometimes students were rushed to finish things. They completed them online and didn't complete the surveys all at once, things like that. There was lots of incomplete or missing data, some random, some non-random. And as our colleagues at Ohio State are going to unpack later, this makes a difference. And then just generally, there were smaller sample sizes than planned for in a lot of the research. A lot of the power analyses that led to sample size calculations for the IES funded research were no longer valid. And these issues had certain impacts on the types of analyses we could do or the inferences we could make. Noisy data reduces statistical power and increases the likelihood of magnitude and sign errors in your inferences. Incomplete or missing data also radically reduce your statistical power, but lead to generalizability issues as well, because you're no longer mapping your inferences back onto the population per se that you've sampled from. And then small sample sizes also create issues around statistical power, signal to noise ratio, and the increased likelihood of magnitude and sign errors. In other words, your estimates being either the wrong magnitude or in the worst case scenario in the wrong direction. The first example that we're going to talk through very briefly is our Purple State 2.0 project, which was IES funded and is a simulation to boost civic skills. If you want to know more about this particular project, you can go to purple-state.org and actually engage with the simulation itself and learn about the research project, or reach out to any one of us on the research team. It was a design-based research project, which meant that we did phases of design and testing and iteration of the design leading up to a final pilot test. The design stages were smaller sample sizes with targeted samples and populations. The final pilot test was envisioned being much larger with a more representative population and resulting or culminating in a quasi-experimental study so that we could both track the costs per IES regulation, but then also the effects of, and come up with decent cost effectiveness estimates moving into other rounds of funding and research. That wasn't possible once COVID happened. If you noticed our design-based window, the second stages and finally leading into the pilot stage were during the acute stages of the COVID pandemic. And so instead of doing a quasi-experimental study where we had large groups of students, for example, planned to do both the treatment and in control conditions, we coordinated with the program officer at IES to change the research design. So change number one was in the research design itself. We moved from a between group quasi-experimental design to a within person design, pre-post design, tracking changes within person pre to post. We were still able to monitor those gains on target outcomes and talk about change over time during student use of the Purple State simulation. But we had to give some things up when we did that. We were no longer able to make rigorous causal inferences in the Rubin counterfactual causal model. And that meant also that we could do a cost analysis, but not a rigorous cost effectiveness analysis. So in conversation with our program officer, we moved toward that research model, which would allow us to continue to understand how students used Purple State and how they're experiencing knowledge and affective change over time, and but working in a different research space using different research questions. To do so, we had to adopt a different analytic strategy. And this ended up being Bayesian multi-level modeling. We had always intended to use multi-level modeling because of the clustered nature of the data. Students were clustered by class, clustered by teacher, clustered by school, clustered by district, clustered by state. There was a lot of clustering. We were always going to use a multi-level approach. But as our sample sizes began to fall drastically during the acute phase of COVID, we found ourselves in a scenario where we were below thresholds. The same reason we were below thresholds to do our quasi-experimental study, we were no longer able to reasonably rely upon standard maximum likelihood or ordinary least squares based statistical models. Instead, by taking a Bayesian approach, we gained some capabilities. We were able to communicate uncertainty better. We were able to regularize our estimates, and I'll explain what all these mean briefly in a second. Adjust for measurement error and impute missing values, all within the same framework. We didn't have to seek different approaches to do all of these things. Now, this also came at a cost. Number one, there's a steep learning curve. Very few people in educational sciences at the moment are trained to use this skill set. Second, it is computationally more intensive. Doing especially the imputational task and the measurement error adjustment tasks can be very taxing on computational resources and take a long time. But as you can see, and as I'll show, these abilities of Bayesian multi-level modeling mapped very well onto the issues and impacts that we were noticing or that we were predicting would be the case with our data. in terms of noisy data, missing data, and the issues around small sample sizes. The first thing that I'd like to very briefly discuss is the fact that a Bayesian approach allows you to communicate uncertainty better. Instead of reporting an estimated effect with a standard error, or even worse, an effect size and a p-value, you're able to display the full range of uncertainty through your posterior distribution and employ a couple of other levels of information that allow you to talk about your uncertainty. You can talk about the probability of direction of the effect, which is the proportion of your posterior distribution above or below zero, and talk about the ROPE, the region of practical equivalence. In other words, the area on either side of zero, or whatever your target value is, that because of measurement error can be treated as effectively the same. So layering this type of information onto our outputs helped us to guard against spurious findings and helped us to better fully understand the uncertainty that was inherent to our data because of the sample size. And just to point out, for example, to read this, you can see the plot on the right-hand side. Those are the posterior estimates of whatever our coefficients were in this particular model, which is just a pre-post model nested by student, nested by teacher. It's a gain score model nested by student and teacher. And what we're modeling here is the change over time and the effect of student perception of classroom climate on that change score. And we see that there is strong evidence, 94% probability of direction. So our certainty of the direction is 94% around the relationship between the CC pre and the classroom climate pre and the outcome. And time, we're practically completely certain that there is a positive effect of time in this model. We're less certain of an interaction effect. We see that we're only 66 to 67 or so % certain of that interaction effect. And again, I'm not going to explain all the details of Bayesian modeling, just showing you that this looks quite different than your standard regression output. And it does so with great benefit because we are able to understand the uncertainty in the estimates better. The Bayesian approach also generally allows for what's called regularization. And I'm going to skip ahead on my little bullet points here. This is very similar to ridge regression, something that machine learning folks do quite a bit, which by regularizing your estimates, you prevent your model from overfitting your data. Maximum likelihood and ordinary least squares will work very hard to fit as nicely as possible to the data that are presented and explain variability within that data set. But often what we want to do is predict future sets of data. What would learning look like in a different classroom? And prediction models require you to be regularized, to slightly downwardly bias your estimate so that you don't overfit the data. So Bayesian models do this in two ways. One, by fitting regularizing priors, and two, in a multi-level modeling framework, by adaptive regularization, what we would call shrinkage, naive Bayesian shrinkage in a standard multi-level framework. So you get, by using a Bayesian multi-level model, you get two different ways that you can allow for regularization, prevention of overfitting of your model to your data, and help to ensure that your model predicts future data in a better way. And we can see kind of in this outcome here, I'll draw attention very quickly. The top model is just a standard regression model, and the bottom is a model that has been regularized. And we see a couple of things. PS is purple state. This is our treatment effect. The standard error, 0.23 on the treatment effect, it goes up quite a bit when we regularize. In other words, we're far less certain about the impact of using purple state in the regularized model. We've reduced overfitting. And also the relationship between pre and post, T0 is pre and post. We see that that standard error has increased a bit too. We're a little more cautious in that second model, and we're less likely to make claims about the population that might be due entirely to variability within the sample itself. With the caveat saying this approach is much more impactful for very small samples. As you start cresting 100 or more individuals, the effect of regularization diminishes with that. The other thing I wanted to talk about is imputation of missing data, which again will come up again very shortly in our colleagues' talk. And imputation in a Bayesian framework allows for better estimation of the bulk effective sample size in general. It gives you more, it allows you to keep all of your data in the model. You don't delete any rows of data, which is good. You keep all of your subjects. We see here the difference between 22 and 30 subjects in this in these models. So here we had to drop 8 students because of listwise deletion, whereas here we were able to keep them when we imputed. But a more kind of important story to tell here, above and beyond just the imputation itself, is the fact that imputation in a Bayesian framework can also be for non-random. If you can model the missingness, if you can model and predict the missingness through structural variables of time and different demographic or other information, you can include that and impute your missing values for some non-random missing cases or scenarios as well. So we've got, so far, better description of uncertainty, regularization, so better predictions in the future, missing imputation, which is built directly into the process if you need to use it. And then finally, the adjustment for measurement error. Measurement error is less of a deal when you have a lot of data, because you can estimate your average differences with a robust estimate with a large enough sample size. When you have a small sample size, any significant amount of measurement error in your instruments is going to start increasing your residual variability if it's on your outcome, or it's going, if you've got too much measurement error in your predictors, it can lead to wild and random reversals of the effects because of the covariance algebra involved. So using a Bayesian approach, you can actually integrate information about the uncertainty of the estimate into the regression model itself. And again, without going into the technical details, what we were able to do, for example, looking at pre-post knowledge gains for the small subsample of students that we were able to get some quasi-experimental data on, we were able to include information about measurement error in the knowledge gains. And when we included the information about measurement error, the estimate was slightly flatter. It was a little more conservative when we adjusted for measurement error, which is important because, again, we're dealing with small sample sizes. So having the ability to incorporate that information and make better inferences is always great. But as I said before, it's computationally intensive. Be ready to make a cup of coffee or go brew a pot of tea and then come back and then interpret your results. We missed the ball on something, though, as well, which is that we, because of our IRB and the way the IRB was structured under the original research design, did not collect a lot of student-level demographic data. Had we done so, we could have engaged in multi-level regression with post-stratification, MRP or Mr. P, which would have allowed us to take our inferences from our relatively smaller sample sizes and do a better job of mapping those inferences on to the populations in the 2 states that the research was conducted in. We missed the opportunity to do that because we didn't have the pertinent student level demographics to then post-stratify onto the district and state levels. So that was a takeaway in that regard. So overall, our big lessons learned were that pivoting research questions allowed us to continue the work, but it changed the nature of the work. We weren't able to ask and answer the same types of questions or provide the same information to the literature. Bayesian multi-level modeling gave us tools to deal with noisy and missing data, but there was a steep learning curve and they're computationally intensive. Try to collect student demographic information, even if your theory of action doesn't require it. We didn't think we needed it for our theories of action. We didn't have a good reason to collect it, but then it ended up that not having certain key student demographic information prevented us from post-stratifying after. And that is the conclusion of this section of the talk.
Fantastic. Thank you, Shane. In the time that you start between when you started and when you finished, we I think tripled in size. We went from like 8 maybe to now we're at 26 participants. So those of you who are new coming in the last 5 minutes, welcome. Glad to see you all. Just a quick heads up that there's a button on the bottom of your screen called Q&A. So if you have questions and comments, just go ahead and post over there. I will keep track of those and bring them up as we go. I don't see anything right now, but I'll just ask right now, are there any sort of comments, questions, or just points of discussion that you would like to bring up at the moment? You know, as we said at the beginning, this session is really structured as sort of a conversation. We're sitting all together at a virtual table, and we're really just eager to have a conversation about this. Shane and I are on the same project here and would love to engage in conversation about this. And so, yeah, as folks have, you know, questions or comments, just jump in. Going once, going twice. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
I have a very basic question. Can you explain to me what regularized estimates mean? Is that the same as normalizing estimates, or?
So that's a very good question. Regularizing, the way that I think of it is you add a little bit of bias. You make your estimate a little smaller, a little more conservative, so that it doesn't fit your small data set quite as well. So you're adding a small amount of noise to the data to reduce the fit to the data. But in doing so, what has been found through various theoretical and actual empirical work is that over time, your prediction of new data gets better. So by reducing the overfitting of your very rigid model to your imperfect sample, you do a better job over time of predicting that trend in the target population. So that's the philosophy of regularization. It's downwardly biasing or adding a little bit of noise to your estimate so that it doesn't fit the sample as perfectly well, but hopefully buys you better predictive capacity later on.
Thank you, Shane. Any other questions?
In what software did you use to run these Bayesian models? Are you running this under the R environment? Primarily,
entirely in R, using
the
RStanArm and BRMS packages, which is to say there's a MCMC type of computational environment called STAN that was NSF and partially IES in some ways funded. Mm-hmm. So federally funded development, hosted at Columbia University, the development team. And that STAN environment allows for multiple types of packages, multiple types of software use within R and other platforms to do Bayesian analyses. I primarily use R, but practically every advanced stats software package at this point allows for Bayesian estimation.
Good. I will just say also that Shane and I have presented this work, particularly with the Bayesian imputation work, and we're more than happy to share code. We're more than happy to share information, and we've got like little primer on how to do this, and so it's all these are all things that, you know, we're very happy to share with folks. Okay. Let's see. Let's continue, unless there's someone else just itching. Okay. Dr. Lin is going to present next and represent the Ohio State team. And after Dr. Lin is done, we will go ahead and bring up any questions and answer Q&A, bring up the Q&A regarding that particular session. And after that, we'll open it up to everybody. So Dr. Lin, it's all yours.
Sounds good. Thank you. Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Digital Civic Learning Project team from The Ohio State University, we are pleased to share our data collection experiences during and after the COVID pandemic years. I am the PI of this project, next page, and my collaborators are Dr. Michael Glassman and Dr. Eric Gandeman. Both of them are here in the session. And we are a team of 16 undergraduate and graduate students, plus 3 PI and co-PIs. And 2 of the graduate students will join us in this presentation. And those people are, I guess, Mason Heimer, you wave your hand, and Wang Jing Cha. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to meet with you. So to provide some background of our project, please go to the next slide of our presentation.
One moment, my PowerPoint just died.
Corrupted?
Yeah, corrupted. I will reset it right now.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Then I will continue.
Okay.
So I just want to give you some background of our project. This is a 4-year innovation and development grant. And it was designed to iteratively develop a 1-year civic learning curriculum in elementary social studies classrooms. We are using blended learning approaches, meaning students are learning how to use technology in the classroom to learn. And our teachers received training to implement a total of 4 instructional units. Each unit lasted for 10 days and 55 minutes a day. Our major student outcomes are digital citizenships, civic reasoning, interpersonal competencies, and academic achievement. Okay, next page. We received this grant right after the first COVID pandemic outbreak in the United States. And despite all the challenges and uncertainties, we embarked the project in July 2020. And we spent 2 years in a total of 12 classrooms to iteratively develop the curriculum. And in year 3, we conducted a quasi-experimental study in 23 classrooms across 3 school districts in Central Ohio. Next page. All of these classrooms and schools are located in neighborhoods where the median household income level was at or above state's median household income level. And the income level ranged from 62K to 151K. For the purpose of this presentation, we classify these schools into lower, mid, and higher SES status. Within these schools, we work with social studies teachers and their students in 4th and 5th grade classrooms. Next page. In the first 2 years, we conducted a design research, and we partnered with both lower SES and higher SES schools. In the 3rd year, we conducted a quasi-experimental study, and we were mainly partnering with lower to mid SES schools. These tables show you how classrooms' learning modes vary significantly between classrooms and between the first 2 years. In year 3, all of the instructions were back in person. Next page. To understand how the COVID pandemic impacts our data collection, we conducted some missing data analysis. But before we share these missing data patterns with you, we want to first share some of the key COVID-related challenges and our strategies to deal with these challenges. In year 1, our major challenge happened because there was a no contact policy, meaning researchers are not allowed to enter school buildings. So we had to conduct all of these interventions and assessments online, remotely. On top of that, schools' learning modes change constantly from fall to spring semester. And even COVID-related policies, such as masking and social distancing rules, vary from schools to schools. In year 2, we had a really challenging start of the school year And that was due to the fear that there would be another COVID outbreak. So we had to postpone all of the student teacher recruitment until things were settled down. And then we then encountered a huge shortage on school bus drivers. And because of this, we had experienced unexpected changes in school schedules and learning modes, changes in learning modes. And there were constant student and teacher absences because of their sickness or people are being quarantined. And in year 2, we also observed that some of our students were really struggling to collaborate with students, with their peers in our inquiry-based activities. And this may be attributed to their previous stay-home learning experience. In year 3, our major challenge occurred because of the recent political debates about social studies curriculum, social emotional learning, and parents' perceptions about research in schools. There were also some discussions about inclusion issues, such as whether survey items were designed appropriately to include or to be more accessible to students from culturally, socially diverse backgrounds. And starting in year 3, we also observed that some teachers started to have some pushback on the use of technology. In some of our activities, they would prefer to have paper and pencil formats over computers. And the last but not least challenge might be similar to all studies that include business as usual control conditions. We had some challenge in building rapports with teachers and students in the control classrooms, mainly due to the limited opportunities to communicate and explain our studies with them. Next page. So how do we deal with these challenges? Starting in year 1, our team have developed a couple of remote data collection strategies to ensure that data could be collected and safely and properly saved in our data server from the field. We collaborated with districts' IT people and teachers to build an effective digital platform and to incorporate our digital curriculum into their learning management system. We use Microsoft Teams, Google Meets, and Zoom. We even positioned camcorders in the classroom for classroom observation. And thanks to the one-to-one technology policy in schools, students were assigned, each student has their own Chromebook, and they were able to use Chromebook to communicate with researchers. We also use a social platform to maintain our communication with teachers. And all of these technological infrastructures were effective in reducing our missing data rate. And starting in year 2, we began to increase our physical contact with school teachers and students. And teachers really appreciated these in-person on-site support. But we really had to make our instruction and assessment timelines flexible in accordance to any unexpected or expected changes due to COVID-related factors. Okay, next page. So now let's look at our missing data patterns. And we want to start with consent rate. The 3 tables show you the average consent rates from different schools with associated with their SES status. And a clear pattern that you can see is that the consent rate tends to be lower in lower SES schools than higher SES schools. But in year 3, where we mainly work with lower to mid-level SES schools, SES was not a significant factor. However, there were higher consent rate in the experimental group than the control group. And that goes back to that ability to build a strong rapport with teachers. And now I want to invite August to talk about our missing data patterns based on surveys.
Hi. Yes, thank you, Dr. Lin. So the approach we took for this next section was to really look at our pre and post self-report survey measures. And these assessed key variables of interest to the study, such as digital and online engagement, social perspective taking, and various other interpersonal skills. And so what I'm presenting here on this slide is just an overall summary of our missing values from the first year, with the dark green representing incomplete data and the light blue representing complete data. And so, as unsurprisingly, we had a lot of incomplete data for this first major COVID year. All of the variables had some level of missing data. And the majority of the students, about 89%, also had some incomplete data, which if we then look at the item levels, that results in about 21% of our data being missing, which is a very substantial number and indicates that, one, we can't just use general approaches such as deletion or even possibly some forms of imputation. We actually have to investigate the nature of this data. And so we conducted a few analyses, with the next slide presenting just kind of an overview of the items and scales with kind of the highest missing rates. And what we can see here is right from the start, there are some items with very high proportions of missing values, particularly concerning online and digital engagement. And so once again, the key question we asked with the team is, well, why is this occurring? What might predict these, so that we know which variables might be important to include in these future estimation models. And so on the next slide, we have just the results of a basic logistic regression model predicting the missingness of these variables that we previously shown. We stuck with just two predictors for which we had information related to all students, and that's the school SES as well as their grade level. And just with these two predictors, we found some interesting and immediate patterns right away, with students from lower SES schools tending to have greater missingness related to the digital citizenship scale, and that's for both the pre and post measures. Similarly, for the LMS or learning management system interactions, students from fourth grade also tended to have greater missingness. And last, for the social value scales, students from higher SES schools tended to have greater missingness. So right away, we're seeing a pattern where missingness is definitely not at random, and there are variables we need to account for in future analyses. For year two on the next slide, we did a similar kind of approach, looking at, once again, this overall summary of missing. And we can see some good news for us is that in year two, missing rates did decrease per the strategies Dr. Lin shared earlier, with only about this time 57% of students having some level of incomplete data, but then the overall item level values or missing values decreased to about 5.5%, which is still substantial and something we need to account for, but a lot lower than the previous year when we first encountered this strange, how do we deal with collecting data during COVID? But then if we move to the next slide, where we once again break down the items, we did see some interesting patterns and new things emerge, where we added a set of demographic questions, particularly assessing students' SES, because we have school SES for a lot of these individuals, but the school SES isn't necessarily representative of the individual's SES. And so we added some questions that are generally used to assess these, but we actually found that these questions in particular tended to have very high amounts of missing data, with parental education questions in particular missing almost about half of the sample, almost missing these questions. And then we did notice, thankfully, fewer missing rates for similar scales from the previous year, such as the digital citizenship, or this time social capital, students felt. And so we, on the next slide, conducted a similar set of logistic regressions, once again using the two predictors we had complete data for with every student. And in this time, we actually found a relatively consistent pattern, with lower SES schools tending to have greater missingness on all of the main variables of interest that had a high degree of missingness. So paternal education specifically, digital citizenship, and self-oriented motive. And then we ran models for maternal education and online shyness, but we actually found those models to be not significant. So those are ones that need further investigation. And then finally, we did the same thing on year 3, which is, remember, we switched to a quasi-experimental design. So not only did we have this new format and this new group, we also had a significantly higher number of participants and schools and teachers to collaborate with. And so our missing data did increase a bit. It isn't quite as high as it was in year 1. But there were some students who had a lot of missingness, and the overall missing rate was about 12.5% for the full data set. And so looking once again on the next slide where we break down the items, we do see that the parental education questions were again the highest missed, with this time over 50% of students not responding to these questions. And then we see there are some different measures here. So the social capital measure was another prevalent high missingness variable that we had. And so this time we ran the logistic regression models again on the next slide, though we did want to account for the quasi-experimental nature of this year. And so we opted to include condition in these models that we're presenting right now. And the reason we didn't include both of the predictors, condition and school SES, is because they were too highly correlated with one another for the same model. But we did run separate models we can show and share later if anyone is interested. But overall, what we found for the digital citizenship scale is that the 4th grade students tended to have greater missingness. The social capital, both the bridging and bonding scale, students in the control condition tended to have greater missingness. And while the paternal education model was not significant, we did find a significant model for the maternal education. However, none of the predictors were significant. So that points to a likely other variable for which we didn't include in the model, being a key predictor. And so overall, these insights give us great insights into the patterns of missingness. And then I want to give it to my colleague Wanjun, who's going to talk about now our in the field data collection and what that looked like.
Thank you, August. I'm going to present the missing data patterns found in qualitative data. Our team observed the curriculum implementation, both with camcorder and online recordings. And to better capture the curriculum implementation and students' learning processes, we recorded the whole class instruction with camcorder videos and recorded small group discussion with online recordings using video conferencing tools such as Zoom and Microsoft Teams. And as you can see in this PowerPoint slide, there is the greatest variability in year 1 missingness in the video data. And the missing data patterns kind of align with the learning mode of how the curriculum was implemented. For instance, teacher A, who conducted the curriculum in person, had the least missingness in camcorder videos. And if you can move on to the next slide, we can see that the teacher A has the highest number of missingness in online recordings. On the other hand, teacher B, who has implemented our curriculum fully online, has the least amount of missingness in online recordings because by default, she had to use Zoom in order to conduct classes. Teacher C and D, who have implemented our curriculum in hybrid mode, where most or all of the students joined the lesson online, showed a missing data pattern, which is in between teacher A and B. And as you can see, the missingness decreases as the unit progresses, since teachers become more accustomed to our recording procedures and our curriculum. And if you can move on to the next slide. In year 2, there is not much variability in camcorder videos, although the number of missing videos significantly decreases in the later units. And to the next slide, when it comes to the online recording, the number of missing videos was higher in the lower SES schools. This may be due to the characteristics of an individual teacher or Wi-Fi quality in schools. As with the camcorder videos, the missingness decreases significantly during units 3 and 4 as compared to units 1 and 2. In fact, there's no missingness at all in the later units in online recording. This is because, as Dr. Lin mentioned, the research assistants were able to enter classes from year 2. And even on occasions where we are not present in classrooms, we were able to support our teacher remotely via Zoom, such as asking them to turn on their camcorder videos or hit the recording buttons. If you move on to the next slide, there is not much variability in the number of camcorder and online recordings in year 3. So if you can move on to the next slide, the missingness was usually caused by some non-systematic factors, such as miscommunication between the teacher, or a curriculum was led by a substitute teacher, which made us unable to record the video. For our discussion and conclusion, I'm going to yield the floor to Dr. Lin.
Thank you. So to summarize, our missing data analysis suggests that, unsurprisingly, our data are not missing at random. Each year, we encountered unique challenges that were directly or indirectly related to the COVID pandemic. And we once thought that this past year would be a little bit easier for us to collaborate with schools. Unfortunately, the tensions that we saw between school districts, teachers, and parents continue to escalate, and it led to a lot of changes in schools and state policies. So one important take-home message for all of us who have conducted school-based research over these past years is to make considerable efforts to identify these COVID-related factors and seek ways to incorporate them in our future missing data imputation and statistical modeling. And of course, we can always refer back to purple states Bayesian models to address these possible noise in our data sets. Our findings also showed that the data from lower SES schools tend to have lower consent rates and higher missing values. And based on our observations from these schools, we believe that this single factors schools' SES status is associated with a host of COVID-related factors. And unfortunately, we have not been able to tease them apart. And these factors could include things like working parents' loads of chores and responsibilities, learning modes that were constantly changing, high levels of teacher and student staff turnover, troubles to provide sufficient technological support, such as Wi-Fi stability and number of headsets in the classroom, and the quality of learning management system or the proportion of English language learners. So before collecting data in these schools, we highly recommend researchers to spend a decent amount of time with meeting with school administrators and teachers to understand their unique needs. The good news from our data is that we were able to initiate some effective communication processes with district IT people and teachers. And this allowed us to streamline our assessment and intervention procedures and to avoid potential large amount of data loss. And this can be, this is supported by some of our missing data pattern revealed in the qualitative data and the survey data from year 1 to year 2. Next slide. So based on our pre and post-test survey data, the highest level of missing values were found in scales or items related to students' demographic information, technology use in the classroom, and their online social capital or social experiences. And we have to say, measuring these constructs during and after COVID is challenging because some of these definitions are constantly changing given the current political social climate. And even students' online experience have been changing dynamically over these years. So one of our solutions in the future is to triangulate these quantitative data with our qualitative interviews to get a better understanding of students' digital learning and social experiences. And it is also our responsibility to make these questions more accessible and inclusive to elementary school children coming from diverse social cultural backgrounds. The last but not least lesson that we've learned is that even though technology such as Qualtrics has provided a lot of convenience to researchers, it could potentially cause a significant amount of data loss and frustration from our participants if it is not set up appropriately. We have once encountered a situation where our Qualtrics link for some reason was blocked by school's firewall. And so moving forward, we encourage researchers to pilot testing all the digital assessments within schools' technological environments before formal implementation. And that's all we want to share with you today. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Dr. Lin, and thank you for to everybody in the Ohio State team. At this point, we can take some questions. I don't see anything in the Q&A tab, but I'm happy to open it up for discussion. As I said at the end of Shane's talk, that we view this session as a way to just really freely talk, and so we welcome that. Testing my wait time here. All right. Anybody at the moment? Happy also to open this up for conversation for the entire panel, not just Dr. Lin and your team, but for the whole panel. Anything come? Is anything coming up for folks? All right, I'm seeing something in the chat. Says, could you say more about incorporating uncertainty in the coefficient estimates in the Bayesian regression?
Absolutely. So often that's a great question, and I'm going to acknowledge my name, and that's Charles. So the most of the time when we conduct a statistical analysis, we've been trained to generate a point estimate and a standard error, which are then combined to produce a test statistic and give you a p-value. But most of the communication hinges on the point estimate itself and the p-value. And so people often say the effect was 0.2 standard deviation units and it was statistically significant, and then move on. And that's honestly, if you're under a strict kind of randomized control trial that's sufficiently powered, that might be enough. But with small sample sizes, with observational data, and with a lot of complexity in the data structure, you're at risk of overinterpreting. So we're missing things. So when I say communicating uncertainty, we generally try to communicate the magnitude, direction, and precision of an estimate within a Bayesian framework. The magnitude is usually the mean or median of the posterior estimate. The direction is positive or negative. And then the precision or uncertainty can then be communicated in a few different ways. Often, it is just given as the standard deviation of the posterior. So you'll often see a lot of people, when they're interpreting a Bayesian estimate, will look at the relative magnitude of the mean or median, the central point of the distribution, and the standard deviation itself. If the estimate is greater than the standard deviation, there's a statistical signal that can be discussed generally. If it's more than double the standard deviation, it's effectively statistically significant. The p-value would be less than 0.05 in a null hypothesis testing framework. So I tend to take it a step further. When I describe the findings of a Bayesian model fitting, I will describe, as I said, the magnitude, direction, and precision by giving the entire posterior distribution and talking about the credible intervals, which are kind of my definition of the highest density of that posterior. And Richard Meckelreith generally talks about an 89% credible interval because it's not ever going to be confused with a 95% confidence interval. It's an arbitrarily large enough number to talk about your highest density zone without your mind then accidentally lapsing back into a frequentist paradigm. So when I talk about describing the uncertainty, you don't want to just describe the estimate itself and the potential results of a hypothesis test, because you're obscuring the potential amount of noise or amount of uncertainty. And so if you give the magnitude, direction, and precision, usually by giving the credible interval and actually displaying the posterior, as I showed in one of the slides, that gives the reader a better sense of how much uncertainty is actually in your data and how much certainty they should have in that modal estimate. And that was a very long answer to a short question, but thank you.
Thank you. I'm seeing another one. I'm thinking this is to the Ohio State team. The question is, when your observed variable, say SES, predicts missingness, is that considered missing at random? And as long as you have SES in your prediction model, shouldn't that be okay?
Yeah, I can jump in, and I welcome my team members to jump in as well. My understanding is that when missingness is predicted by certain variables, that means missingness is not missing at random. And it is necessary to control for these predictors, either at the imputation stage or in the later statistical modeling. And the challenge that we encounter in our project is that the single SES factor may be actually reflecting additional factors behind it that we are at this point are not able to tease apart. But in the minimum, in the regression and imputations, we should consider at least that SES variable to control for some systematic missing.
And I think that's a great question, and I agree completely. And I think a good strategy would always be, don't decide for the reader which one you're going to present. Show the results of the entire taxonomy of potential models that could be fitted with and without the imputation, or treating imputation as random or non-random, to show the range of potential ways that your model's reflecting reality, and then be courteous enough to interpret, like give the reader a table that they can rely upon to better understand that there's not just uncertainty from the data, there's uncertainty from the analytic process itself, what a lot of people call researcher degrees of freedom. And we all make them. We make decisions when we analyze data. I think the right answer, especially when there's missingness and uncertainty about the uncertainty, is just present everything so that the entire range of potential outcome or potential universes that can be predicted by your model are reflected.
Yeah, I did have a question about the SES data that you collected. It was interesting. I'm wondering, like, how did you get those data? So, like, median household income, I'm assuming you got that from schools. But how about things like parent educational level? Was that a self-report thing, or is that collected from schools?
Yes, those are based on self-report student surveys. And in addition to student report, we request student data from districts. Districts would provide free and reduced lunch status, which allowed us to triangulate across these SES related variables.
Were items that were adapted from the Monitoring the Future studies.
Okay. Yeah, because I could imagine a fourth grader going, I don't know if my parent went to grad school, or because that's kind of hard.
That is what we experienced, right? With that 50% missing. Yeah.
Yeah. And that could definitely be seen, especially in schools that are at that school level, where the level of analysis of school, the SES, or at least the percentage of students on free and reduced lunch is higher. That's something that you can definitely see, that variable being, a lot missing. And that would further sort of confirm this issue that it's not missing at random. Good. Yeah. Any other thoughts? We end at 5:30. Is that right?
That is correct. And I just want, so I'm going to make one final push, as Jason said early on. I'm not sure if it was in the midpoint or the end point of our first talk. Reach out to us if you want any code, any examples of the application of what we spoke about. We're happy to share all of our code. I can simulate some data. You can try it out yourself. I'll walk you through it on Zoom. I'm always happy to kind of help other people make sense of these types of methods.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, to let you all know, these are data about motivation. So these are Likert type scales, but they're also about knowledge. I think we have some knowledge items right there. So these are all sort of pretty standard types of things that a lot of you all are modeling. And so we're totally happy to do that. All right, well, it is 5:30. So great to see everybody. And as the chat person said, please take a minute to rate this session in the platform. So hop onto the platform, rate the session, and good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.